Changho didn't move immediately after it was over. The street had already returned to normal. The tension that had filled the space minutes ago had dissolved into the quiet rhythm of passing cars and distant conversation, as if nothing had happened at all. Anyone walking by would have seen nothing out of place. That was the point. Control wasn't about spectacle. It was about ensuring there was nothing left to question. His gaze remained fixed in the direction Amara had gone, his posture unchanged, hands resting loosely at his sides. He could still track her movement without seeing her directly. The pace of her steps, the hesitation she tried to mask, the way her awareness shifted when she thought she was alone. She was learning. Faster than she should have. Han stepped up beside him, his presence familiar but edged with something that hadn't been there before. "You're letting this go too far," Han said. Changho didn't respond right away. He let the words settle, not because he needed time to consider them, but because he didn't feel the need to answer immediately. Han exhaled sharply. "She shouldn't still be here." "She is," Changho replied. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." Han's jaw tightened, but he didn't push the point the way he normally would have. That alone was enough to confirm what Changho already knew. This wasn't just concern. It was pressure. From the pack. From the structure that existed whether Amara understood it or not. "She's already been seen," Han said. "You know how this works." Changho did. That was the problem. He shifted his gaze slightly, not toward Han, but toward the far end of the street where the last traces of Amara's presence had faded into the crowd. "I'm aware," he said. "Then you also know what happens if this isn't handled." There was no threat in Han's tone. There didn't need to be. Consequences didn't require emphasis. They existed whether anyone acknowledged them out loud or not. Changho finally turned his head, meeting Han's gaze with the same steady composure he had maintained from the start. "I said I'll handle it." The words were quiet, but final. Han held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a short nod. Not agreement, acknowledgement. That was all that was required. Without another word, he stepped back and walked away, leaving the space exactly as he had found it. Changho remained where he was. He didn't follow her immediately. There was no urgency in it. No need to close the distance when he already knew where she was going. He moved when it made sense. When the timing aligned. When the space between them was exactly what it needed to be. By the time he reached the main road, she had already blended into the movement of the city. Students, locals, traffic, everything layered together in a way that would make her easy to lose if you were looking for someone who didn't know how to pay attention. But she did. That was what set her apart. Changho slowed as he approached the corner, his gaze settling on her without hesitation. She didn't look back, didn't search for him, but her posture wasn't relaxed either. There was a tension there now, subtle but consistent, like her instincts hadn't decided whether to settle or stay alert. She was adjusting, not panicking, not ignoring it, adjusting. His attention sharpened slightly. Most people, after something like that, chose distance. They avoided the places that felt wrong, avoided the questions that didn't have immediate answers, avoided anything that forced them to acknowledge what they didn't understand. Amara had done the opposite. She had gone back. Not blindly, not carelessly, but deliberately. Changho watched as she paused briefly at the edge of the street, her gaze shifting just enough to scan her surroundings without making it obvious. She was looking for patterns now, for repetition, for confirmation, a small detail, but significant. He stepped forward, blending into the movement of the sidewalk without drawing attention to himself. There was no reason to hide, but there was also no reason to be seen unless he chose to be. Distance mattered. Not for him. For her. If he stayed too close, she would react. If he stayed too far, she would lose the thread. This, right here, was the balance. He followed at a pace that matched the flow of the street, his focus never wavering even as the environment shifted around them. The city made it easy. Noise covered presence. Movement concealed intention. But none of that applied to her. Not anymore. She slowed again, just slightly, her attention catching on something ahead of her. It wasn't obvious to anyone else. No sudden stop, no visible reaction. Just a shift. Changho tracked it instantly. A parked car. Same model. Same position as before. Not coincidence. Not anymore. His gaze moved briefly beyond it, catching the figure leaning against the building just past the intersection. Still. Waiting. Watching in a way that would go unnoticed by anyone who wasn't already paying attention. Amara's head tilted slightly, just enough to confirm she had seen it too. Not everything, but enough. Changho's expression didn't change, but something settled into place. She wasn't just aware. She was learning how to move through it. That changed the situation. More than Han realized. More than the others would be willing to tolerate. He adjusted his path without breaking stride, closing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic without making it obvious. Not close enough to touch. Not close enough to be questioned. But close enough that if something moved, he would already be there. He had intended to keep this contained. Clean. A situation handled quickly, without disruption. That had been the expectation. That had been the plan. But plans relied on predictable variables. And she wasn't one. Changho watched her take another step forward, her attention steady now, her hesitation replaced with something quieter. Intentional. She wasn't trying to leave this behind anymore. She was trying to understand it. That alone made her dangerous. Not to him. To the balance that kept everything else in place. His gaze narrowed slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition. This wasn't going to resolve itself. Not quickly. Not cleanly. And not without consequence. He didn't look away as she crossed the street, the distance between them holding exactly where he intended it. For now, that was enough. For now, observation still served its purpose. But that window was closing. He could see it in the way she moved. In the way she watched. In the way she didn't step back when instinct told her she should. Changho adjusted his pace again, his attention fixed, his presence steady in a way that didn't require acknowledgement to exist. She had already crossed the line. The only question now was how far she was willing to go. Changho didn't follow her into the cafe. He didn't need to. The location itself worked in his favor. Open glass, controlled entry points, predictable movement. Spaces like that made observation easier, not harder. People assumed visibility meant safety. They relaxed in places where they could see everything around them. That assumption was useful. He took position across the street, just far enough to avoid attention, close enough to maintain a clear line of sight through the window. From there, he could see her without interruption. Amara sat near the front, angled slightly toward the window, her posture relaxed enough to appear normal. Across from her, Raylan spoke with the easy energy of someone unaware of the shift happening just beneath the surface. Amara responded when she needed to. She nodded, spoke, even smiled once, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her attention moved differently now. Not scattered. Not distracted. Intentional. Changho watched the way her gaze tracked the room in intervals rather than continuously, how she allowed space between observations instead of making them obvious. She wasn't searching blindly anymore. She was measuring, learning. The change had happened quickly, faster than expected. Most people needed more time to adjust after exposure, needed distance to process what they had seen before they could move through it without reacting. She had skipped that step entirely. That wasn't instinct. That was choice. Han would call it a liability. Others would call it a risk. Changho understood it for what it was. A variable that didn't behave the way it should. He shifted his stance slightly, his attention moving beyond the cafe for a brief moment. The street remained steady, traffic consistent, pedestrians moving without disruption, but there were small deviations if you knew where to look. The same car from earlier had passed once. Then again. Not enough to draw attention. Enough to confirm intent. Across the block, a man lingered near the corner, his posture too still for someone waiting casually. His focus didn't move with the crowd. It stayed fixed, returning to the same point again and again. The cafe. Changho let his gaze rest there for a moment longer, not acknowledging the man directly, but registering him. Not pack. Not aligned. That narrowed the possibilities. He returned his attention to Amara. She had noticed something. Not everything, but enough. Her shoulders had shifted just slightly, her posture tightening for a fraction of a second before settling again. She didn't look directly toward the street, didn't give away what had caught her attention, but the change was there. Subtle. Controlled. She was adapting faster than the situation allowed. That would draw more attention. Not less. Raylan said something that caused Amara to lean forward slightly, her expression softening just enough to respond. The moment passed naturally, blending into the rhythm of the conversation, but it didn't reset her awareness. It layered over it. Two states at once. Normal on the surface. Alert underneath. Changho watched that balance with quiet focus. It wasn't sustainable. Not long-term. Eventually, something would force her to choose. Ignore it and step back. Or lean into it and accept what came with it. From what he had seen so far, there was no question which direction she would take. He adjusted his position again, shifting just enough to change his angle on the street without breaking his line of sight. The man on the corner had moved. Closer now. Still not obvious. Still within the boundaries of normal behavior. But no longer incidental. Changho's expression remained unchanged, but his attention sharpened. This was the part that didn't align. The timing. The persistence. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't coincidence. It was interest. And that interest had nothing to do with caution. Inside the cafe, Amara reached for her cup, her movements steady, but her gaze flicked briefly toward the window this time. Closer. More direct. Not searching. Confirming. For a brief second, her eyes passed over him. She didn't react. Didn't pause. But the moment held just long enough to register. She knew he was there. Not exactly where. Not fully. But enough to account for it. Changho didn't move. Didn't break the line. He let her have that awareness without confirming it outright. Distance still mattered. For now. The man across the street took another step forward. Too close. Changho pushed off the wall. He crossed the street at a measured pace, his movement blending into the flow of the sidewalk without drawing attention. There was no urgency in it, no visible shift that would signal intent to anyone watching. But the distance closed quickly. By the time he reached the cafe entrance, the man had already adjusted his position, turning away just slightly as if to disengage before anything could be called into question. Too late. Changho stopped just outside the door, his presence enough to interrupt the man's movement without a word being exchanged. The space between them tightened. Not physically. Structurally. The man hesitated. Only for a second. But it was enough. Changho met his gaze, calm and direct, his expression giving nothing away. This isn't your area. The statement was quiet, controlled, but it carried exactly the weight it needed to. The man didn't respond immediately. He didn't challenge it either. His gaze flicked briefly toward the cafe window, toward Amara, before returning to Changho. A calculation. Then, a decision. He stepped back, not retreating fully, but enough to disengage. For now, he said, his tone low. Changho didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man turned and walked away, disappearing into the movement of the street without drawing further attention. The disruption dissolved as quickly as it had formed. But the message remained. This wasn't contained anymore. Changho stood there for a moment longer, his attention shifting back to the window. Amara was still inside, still seated, still appearing normal. But her posture had changed again. Subtly, like something had just confirmed what she already suspected. He held that observation for a moment, then stepped back from the door, returning to the edge of the sidewalk. Distance. Control. For now, that was still enough. But not for much longer. Changho gave it time. Not long. Just enough for the moment to settle before he moved again. Inside the cafe, the rhythm returned quickly. Conversations resumed, attention shifted, and whatever tension had brushed the edge of the space dissolved into something indistinguishable from normal. That was how most people processed disruption. They adjusted, then moved on. Amara didn't. He could see it in the way she sat now, her posture composed but not relaxed, her attention no longer drifting in quiet observation. It had narrowed, sharpened, like something had just confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. She didn't look toward the door again. She didn't need to. Awareness didn't always require eye contact. Changho stepped away from the window, giving her a few more minutes before he crossed the street again. Timing mattered more than proximity. If he approached too soon, it would feel reactive. If he waited too long, the moment would lose its edge. When he entered the cafe, no one looked up. The sound of the door opening blended into the background noise, the scent of coffee and conversation masking his presence the way it always did in places like this. People didn't question what felt ordinary. That assumption worked in his favor. Amara felt him before she saw him. He could tell by the way her shoulders shifted slightly, the smallest adjustment in her posture giving away the change in her awareness. She didn't turn immediately. She didn't react the way most people would when something unfamiliar entered their space. She waited, measured. Then she looked up. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. Changho held her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged, his attention steady in a way that made it clear this wasn't coincidence. It never had been. He crossed the remaining distance without breaking that line, stopping at the edge of the table. Close enough now that there was no space left for uncertainty, no distance left to pretend this was anything other than intentional. Raylan glanced up first, her expression shifting from casual awareness to immediate curiosity. Okay, she said lightly, looking between them. I'm starting to feel like I'm missing something. Amara didn't respond to her. Her attention stayed on him. You followed me, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement. Changho considered the wording, then shook his head slightly. No. Her brow lifted just enough to show she didn't believe him. You're here, she said. I am. That's not a coincidence. No. There was no point pretending otherwise. Raylan looked between them again, clearly trying to piece together a conversation she hadn't been invited into. Amara. It's fine, Amara said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Changho's attention shifted briefly to Raylan. Give us a minute. The request wasn't framed as a command, but it carried the same weight. Raylan hesitated, her gaze flicking back to Amara for confirmation. After a brief pause, Amara gave a small nod. Right, Raylan said, standing. I'm going to get another coffee. She didn't move far, but she gave them space. That was enough. Changho returned his attention to Amara, the conversation settling into a quieter space without the distraction. You noticed, he said. Amara leaned back slightly, her arms crossing as she held his gaze. I'm not blind. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He studied her for a moment, not avoiding the question, but deciding how much of it she needed to hear. You noticed the pattern, he said. Her expression shifted, just slightly. There it was. Recognition. She exhaled quietly. So I'm not imagining it. No. The answer came without hesitation. Amara held his gaze for a second longer, then looked past him briefly, toward the window, toward the street beyond it. There was someone out there, she said. Before you came in. Changho didn't follow her gaze. He didn't need to. Yes. Her attention snapped back to him. And you're just going to say that like it's normal. It is. That's not a reassuring answer. It's not meant to be. The honesty landed harder than anything else he could have said. Amara's jaw tightened slightly, frustration surfacing in a way that didn't break her composure but sharpened it. Then explain it, she said. Changho didn't respond immediately. Not because he didn't have an answer. Because giving it would change things in a way that couldn't be undone. You're being watched, he said finally. Her expression didn't shift the way most people's would have. No panic. No visible fear. Just focus. By you, she said. And others. That held her attention. Why? The question came quickly this time, direct and without hesitation. Changho met her gaze, steady and unyielding. Because you were seen. The words settled between them, heavier now that they carried more context. Amara leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to keep the conversation contained. You keep saying that like it means something, she said. What does it actually mean? He held her gaze for a moment longer. Long enough to make it clear that the answer wasn't simple. Long enough to make it clear that she wasn't ready for all of it. It means, he said evenly, that you're not outside of this anymore. The space between them tightened. Not physically. Structurally. Amara's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, her attention locking onto his words as she processed them. That's not what I chose, she said. No, Changho replied. It isn't. The agreement caught her off guard. But he didn't leave room for it to settle. You're still making decisions like you are, he continued. That's the problem. Amara let out a quiet breath, shaking her head slightly. So what? You expect me to just sit inside and pretend none of this is happening? Yes. The answer was immediate, uncomplicated. Her eyes narrowed slightly. That's not going to happen. Changho didn't react to the defiance. He had expected it. I know. That landed differently. Amara paused, her expression shifting just enough to show she hadn't anticipated that response. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she leaned back again, her gaze studying him in a way that had changed from before. Less reactive. More intentional. Then why are you here? She asked. The question held. Clear. Direct. Changho considered it, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the truth of it didn't simplify anything. I'm making sure it doesn't get worse, he said. Her brow lifted slightly. For me. For the situation. The distinction was deliberate, but not entirely accurate. Amara held his gaze, clearly weighing the answer against everything else she had already seen. You stepped in, she said. Back there. Yes. You didn't have to. Changho didn't respond. Because that wasn't entirely true either. Amara watched him for a second longer, then nodded slightly, like she had reached a conclusion she wasn't ready to say out loud. "Right," she said quietly. Changho's attention sharpened just slightly. "What?" She shook her head. "Nothing." But the shift was there. Subtle. Real. She was starting to see it. Not everything. But enough. Changho straightened slightly, the conversation settling into a natural pause. "Stay inside after dark," he said. Amara gave him a look. "You're still doing that?" "Yes." She exhaled, a quiet mix of frustration and something else that hadn't fully surfaced yet. "And if I don't?" Changho held her gaze. This time, the answer didn't come immediately. When it did, it was quieter, more deliberate. "Then I'll be there." The words settled between them, not as a threat, but as a certainty. Amara didn't respond right away, but something in her expression shifted again. Not resistance. Not agreement. Something in between. Changho stepped back then, creating space before the moment could stretch any further. Control wasn't just about proximity. It was about knowing when to end it. "I'll see you around," Raylan said as she returned, her tone careful but observant. Changho gave a slight nod in acknowledgement, then turned and walked out without another word. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could still feel her attention following him as he stepped out into the street, the weight of it settling in a way that was no longer incidental. She was paying attention now, not just to the situation, to him. And that, more than anything else, was where things started to change. Changho didn't return to the main street. Once he stepped away from the cafe, his path shifted naturally, taking him away from the flow of students and into the quieter stretch that bordered the water. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Noise fell off, movement thinned, and the space opened into something less predictable. This was where things were easier to manage. Fewer variables. Fewer witnesses. He slowed near the edge of the walkway, his attention moving across the horizon before settling back toward the city. From here, the line between order and disruption was easier to see. Most people moved through the city without noticing it. The subtle shifts. The way certain areas stayed undisturbed while others carried tension just beneath the surface. The boundaries that weren't marked, but always respected. Amara had started to notice them. Not fully, but enough to make her movements different. That alone was a problem. Changho adjusted his stance slightly, his gaze narrowing as he tracked movement farther down the walkway. Two figures stood near the far end, positioned just outside the range of casual interaction. Their posture wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't neutral either. Too still. Too deliberate. They weren't speaking. They didn't need to. Territory didn't require conversation to be understood. Changho watched them for a moment, his expression unchanged, his attention steady. One of them shifted first, his gaze lifting just enough to acknowledge Changho's presence without fully turning. Recognition. Immediate. The second followed a beat later, his posture adjusting subtly as the dynamic shifted. Neither of them moved forward. Neither of them crossed the invisible line between them. That was enough. For now. Changho held their attention for a moment longer, letting the silence settle into something clear. This wasn't confrontation. It was acknowledgement. Position. Control. After a few seconds, the first man stepped back, not retreating, but shifting his position just enough to signal compliance. The second followed, their presence dissolving into the background without breaking the structure that held the space in place. Changho didn't watch them leave. He had already seen what he needed. The balance was still intact. Barely. His attention shifted back toward the city. Toward her. He didn't need a direct line of sight to track her anymore. Not after the last few days. Her patterns had become consistent enough to predict where she would go, how long she would stay, what she would notice. And more importantly, what she wouldn't. That margin was narrowing. Too quickly. He moved along the edge of the walkway, his pace unhurried, his focus shifting between the space around him and the path he already knew she would take. The city carried her forward the same way it did everyone else, but she didn't move through it the same way anymore. She paused where others didn't, looked where others ignored, adjusted where others stayed predictable. It made her easier to track, and harder to protect. Changho slowed again as he approached the incline that led back toward the main road. From there, the view opened just enough to catch movement at the intersection below. Amara. She had left the cafe. Her path had shifted slightly from what it had been before. Not drastically. Not enough to suggest she was aware of being tracked in any concrete way. But enough to confirm she was making decisions differently. She hesitated at the corner. Just for a second. Her gaze moved, not randomly, not searching, but deliberately, tracking something beyond immediate sight. Changho followed the line of her focus. A reflection in the glass of a storefront across the street. Movement behind her. Not close enough to engage. Not far enough to dismiss. He didn't move right away. He didn't need to. The figure adjusted first, stepping back into the flow of pedestrians before the line could be drawn clearly. A small correction. A subtle retreat. Testing. Amara didn't turn. She didn't give away what she had seen. But her posture shifted. Slightly tighter. More aware. Changho exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in recognition of what was unfolding. This wasn't isolated. It wasn't contained. Interest was spreading. And interest, in a situation like this, didn't stay passive for long. He moved then. Not toward her directly, but along the parallel line that would intercept without closing the distance too quickly. His path cut through the side street, allowing him to approach without disrupting the flow she was already moving through. Control wasn't about proximity. It was about positioning. By the time he reached the corner, she had already crossed. The distance between them held steady, just far enough that she wouldn't question it, just close enough that if something shifted, he would already be within reach. She slowed again. Not enough to stop, but enough to confirm she was still tracking. Changho adjusted his pace to match the environment around him, blending into the movement without losing focus. The second figure didn't reappear. But that didn't mean they were gone. It meant they were adapting. Just like she was. Changho's gaze settled on her again as she moved down the street, her attention forward, her posture composed in a way that masked the shift beneath it. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't retreating. She was learning how to exist inside it. That was the difference. That was what made this unstable. Most people either broke under pressure or avoided it entirely. She was doing neither. She was adjusting. And the more she adjusted, the harder it would be to keep her outside the structure that governed everything else. Changho slowed slightly, his attention sharpening as the space ahead narrowed into a quieter stretch of road. Less movement. Less noise. Less cover. Not ideal. Not with the level of interest already building around her. He didn't call out to her. Didn't close the distance. Not yet. This wasn't the moment for interference. This was the moment to observe how she moved without it. To see whether instinct alone would be enough to keep her out of something she didn't fully understand. Amara took another step forward, then another. The space around her tightening, just enough that the difference could be felt. Not seen. Not yet. But felt. Changho's gaze narrowed slightly, his focus locking in as the situation shifted. She was moving closer to something. And this time, it wasn't just curiosity leading her there. Changho didn't wait for the situation to resolve itself. He had seen enough. From where he stood, the pattern was already clear. Her movements, her pauses, the way she adjusted to the space instead of avoiding it. What had started as curiosity had settled into something more deliberate. She wasn't going to step back, and the longer that continued, the less control he would have over how this unfolded. That alone made the decision simple. He stepped off the curb and crossed the street, his pace steady, direct. There was no reason to approach carefully now, no benefit in maintaining the distance he had kept until this point. That phase had passed. Amara slowed as he closed in, not stopping completely, but enough to acknowledge the shift in the space around her. By the time he reached her, she was already turned slightly in his direction, her attention fixed, her expression composed in a way that told him she had expected this. "You're getting predictable," she said. Changho stopped in front of her, his gaze steady. "And you're not listening." Her brow lifted slightly. "That again?" "Yes." She exhaled quietly, her weight shifting onto one leg as she studied him. "You keep saying that like I'm supposed to just what? Stay inside and pretend none of this exists." "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Amara shook her head, a faint edge of disbelief in her expression. "That's not happening. I'm aware." That caught her off guard. He saw it in the way her expression paused. Not confusion, not surprise, but a moment of recalibration. "Then what are you doing?" she asked. Changho held her gaze for a second, weighing the simplest version of the truth. "Changing how this goes." The words settled between them, quieter than his usual tone, but more direct. Amara frowned slightly. "That's not an explanation." "No," he said. "It's not." She opened her mouth to push again. He cut her off. "Walk with me." Not a suggestion. Not a negotiation. A shift. This time, the hesitation was shorter. Amara studied him, her eyes searching his face for something. Intent, motive, anything that gave the decision more weight. "What's different now?" she asked. Changho didn't look away. "I am." That answer held. For a second longer than expected. Then, she exhaled just slightly. "Fine," she said. Changho turned, setting the direction without checking if she followed. Not out of assumption. Out of certainty. The sound of her steps fell into place beside him a moment later, matching his pace without hesitation. That was all the confirmation he needed. The dynamic had shifted. Not in the way the others would notice. Not yet. But it was there. Clear. Defined. He wasn't watching her anymore. He was bringing her in. Changho kept his pace steady as they moved away from the main road. He didn't look at her right away. Her presence beside him was clear enough without confirmation. The rhythm of her steps, the slight adjustments she made to match his stride, the quiet awareness she carried now that hadn't been there before. It was different from the earlier encounters. Less reaction. More intention. The city shifted gradually as they walked. Noise faded first, replaced by the softer sounds of distant traffic and the low hum of the water ahead. The buildings opened into wider spaces, the path narrowing just enough to feel separate from everything they had just left behind. Controlled. That was why he chose it. Amara broke the silence first. "You do this a lot." Changho kept his gaze forward. "No. Feels like you do." "It doesn't." She let out a quiet breath, somewhere between a sigh and a half-laugh. "Right. That makes sense." He didn't respond. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It held shape now, carried by the steady rhythm of their movement and the unspoken awareness that had settled between them. Amara glanced at him. He felt it. Not the look itself, the shift it caused. The way her attention lingered just long enough to register, then pulled back as if she hadn't meant to hold it that long. "You always this intense?" she asked. Changho considered the question. "Yes. That's not surprising." Her tone was light, but there was something beneath it now. Not discomfort. Not quite ease either. Something in between. He adjusted his pace slightly as the path curved toward the waterfront, the open space ahead giving way to a clear line of sight over the water. The light had shifted again, settling into that softer edge between late afternoon and evening. Amara slowed just a fraction as the view opened up. Not stopping. Just noticing. Changho stopped near the edge. She came to a halt beside him a second later. Close. Closer than before. Not by accident. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the water carried the space, steady and low, filling the silence without breaking it. Amara rested her hands lightly against the railing, her gaze drifting out over the horizon before returning, not to the city. To him. "You brought me all the way out here just to stand?" she asked. Changho turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "I brought you somewhere you'd stop moving." That landed. She held his gaze for a second, her expression shifting just enough to show she hadn't expected that answer. "I wasn't running," she said. "No," he replied. "You weren't." Her brow lifted slightly. "Then what was I doing?" Changho studied her for a moment. "Looking," he said. Amara exhaled softly, her attention dropping briefly before returning to him. "And now? Now you're here." That pulled a small reaction from her, subtle but real. She leaned back slightly against the railing, turning toward him more fully, her posture relaxed but her attention focused. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Answering questions without actually explaining anything." "That's because you're asking the wrong ones." Her lips pressed together briefly, like she was deciding whether to be annoyed or amused. "Okay," she said. "Then what should I be asking?" Changho didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't have one. Because the shift in the conversation mattered more than the question itself. "You should be asking why you didn't walk away," he said. The words settled between them. Different from everything else he had said so far. Amara stilled slightly, her attention locking onto his. "That's easy," she said after a moment. "No, it isn't." She held his gaze, something sharper moving behind her expression now. "I don't like not knowing things," she said. "That's part of it." "And the other part?" Changho didn't respond right away. His gaze didn't move from hers, steady in a way that made the silence stretch just long enough to carry weight. "You're not afraid of it," he said finally. That one landed. Amara didn't look away this time. Didn't deflect. She just held his gaze, her expression quieter now, more focused. "You say that like it's a problem," she said. "It is. For you?" Changho didn't answer that. The space between them shifted again. Not visibly, but in awareness. He became more aware of the distance between them, how little of it there was now, how easily it could be closed, how deliberate both of them were in not moving. Amara's attention flicked briefly to his mouth, then back to his eyes. Quick, but not unintentional. Changho noticed. He didn't react, but he didn't ignore it either. "You're watching me differently now," she said. Changho tilted his head slightly. "You noticed." "I notice a lot." "I know." That earned another small pause. Amara let out a quiet breath, her gaze softening just slightly, not losing focus, just shifting. "Then what changed?" she asked. Changho held her gaze. This time, the answer came without deflection. "I did." The words sat between them. Simple, but heavier than anything else he had said so far. Amara studied him for a moment longer, like she was trying to decide if she believed that, or if she wanted to. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. And for the first time since this started, there was no urgency in the space between them. No pressure from outside it. No interruption waiting to break it apart. Just stillness and awareness. Changho stepped back first. Not abruptly. Just enough to shift the moment before it settled into something else entirely. "That's enough for now," he said. Amara blinked once, like she had almost forgotten where she was. "That's it?" she asked. "For now." She let out a small breath, something unreadable in it this time. "Right," she said. Changho turned slightly, giving her space again, but not the same distance as before. Not the kind that reset things. The kind that held them in place. She didn't step away immediately. That mattered more than anything else. Changho didn't move immediately. He gave her space to process it. Not out of consideration. Out of necessity. Moments like that, quiet, uninterrupted, unstructured, had a way of settling deeper than anything said out loud. Interfering with it too soon would undo what had just shifted. Amara stayed where she was, her hands still resting lightly against the railing, her gaze no longer fixed on the water. It stayed on him. He felt it. Not the same way he had before. Before, it had been awareness, surface level, reactive, instinctive. Now it held. Focused. Intentional. That was new. That was the change. He turned slightly, just enough to break the direct line between them without fully stepping away. "If you keep moving the way you have been," he said, his tone even, "this won't stay contained." Amara didn't respond right away. He let the silence sit, let the weight of it settle without softening it. Finally she spoke. "You keep saying that," she said, "but you're still here." Changho's gaze shifted back to her. "That's not a contradiction." "It kind of is." "No," he said. "It isn't." Her brow lifted slightly like she was about to push again, but she stopped. Not because she didn't have anything to say. Because she was thinking. That mattered. The air between them held steady, no longer tight with tension, but not relaxed either. It had settled into something more controlled, more aware. Amara shifted her weight, turning toward him fully again. "You could have just left me out of it," she said. "No." The answer came clean. Immediate. She stilled slightly. "Why not?" Changho held her gaze. "Because the truth wasn't simple. And for the first time, it wasn't entirely strategic either." "You were already in it," he said. "That's not what I mean." "I know." Her expression tightened slightly, frustration surfacing again, but not the same kind as before. Not reactive. Measured. "Then say what you mean," she said. Changho didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't have one. Because the line between what he could say and what he shouldn't was no longer as clear as it had been. That alone was a problem. She's adapting too quickly. The thought came uninvited. Not spoken. Recognized. And once recognized, it stayed. He shifted his stance slightly, the smallest adjustment, but enough to create distance again, not physical but structural. Re-establishing control. "You don't step into something like this halfway," he said finally. "You either stay out of it, or you don't." Amara's gaze held his. "And you think I've already decided?" "I know you have." That landed. He saw it in the way her expression paused, not in surprise, but in recognition. Because she had. She just hadn't said it out loud yet. A quiet breath left her. Not frustration this time. Something closer to acceptance. "Then what happens next?" she asked. Changho didn't look away. "That depends on you." She studied him for a moment longer, like she was trying to decide whether that answer was real or just another way of not explaining things. Then, slowly, she nodded. Not agreement. Not fully. But enough. Changho stepped back again, this time more deliberately. The moment had reached its limit. Pushing it further wouldn't strengthen it. It would break it. "Stay aware," he said. Amara gave a small, almost disbelieving breath. That's it? For now. She shook her head slightly, but there was no real resistance in it anymore. Right, she said. Changho turned then, his attention shifting forward as he moved away from the overlook. The space between them widened again with each step, the distance returning in a way that should have reset everything back to what it had been before. But it didn't. Not this time. He felt it. The difference. Not in her position. Not in the environment. In the awareness that followed him. She wasn't just part of the situation anymore. She was paying attention to him. Changho's pace remained steady as he moved back toward the city, his focus shifting outward again, toward structure, toward movement, toward the balance that still needed to be maintained. But something stayed with him. Not distraction. Not hesitation. Recognition. This wasn't going to stay controlled. Not the way it had been. Not with her moving the way she was. Not with him responding the way he had. That was the reality of it. Clear. Unavoidable. And for the first time since this began. It wasn't just about keeping the situation contained. It was about what happened if it didn't.